Tisha B'Av is the day set aside for Kinnos, the day set aside for lamentations. It was the original Tisha B'Av when the Jews were in the Midbar after leaving Mitzrayim and sent spies, Meraglim, on a reconnaissance mission to Eretz Yisrael. The spies returned with a negative report, and the people hearing the negative report cried in their tents. And Hashem said, on that day, which was Tisha B'Av, Atem bechisem bechia shel chinam, you cried, crying for no good reason, because you should have trusted in Hashem to deliver on His promise, to bring the people to Israel and to conquer the inhabitants of the land. Ani ekva lachem bechia ledoros. I'm going to establish for you a crying for all generations on this day. And so it has been. On Tisha B'Av, the two Batei Mikdashos were destroyed. On Tisha B'Av, Beitar was captured. On Tisha B'Av, Turnus Rufus, the evil Roman general, plowed the area of the Beis HaMikdash where it had once stood. Tisha B'Av is the day set aside for crying. And that's what Kinnos are all about. They're about crying out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We cry out for Eicha Yashva Vadad, for being in this desolate and lonely place without our Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. This year, with the coronavirus, we were able to have perhaps a greater appreciation than usual for this idea of Eicha Yashva Vadad, for crying out over the loneliness and the desolation, when for so long we couldn't even go to our shuls locally. Now, even when we're able to go back to our shuls to some degree, it's with a limited population. It's with all kinds of social distancing restrictions. Gives us a sense of just how lonely and forlorn we should feel all the time, and not being able to enter into the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, not be able to have the Malchus Beis David ruling over a sovereign state in Eretz Yisrael. It's the Eicha Yashra Vadad of Yirmiyahu that enables us to say our Kinnos, to say our lamentations, to cry out every single year to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rav Soloveitchik noted that everything that we do has to have some type of a license, has to have some type of a matir. It was Yirmiyahu that gave us that matir, the formula of how to cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I would suggest that perhaps the idea of our crying out on Tisha B'Av is a preemptive measure, that we don't want to have to suffer additional tragedies and cry over additional sad events that have occurred to the Jewish people throughout the millennia. So we try to take the initiative and cry out ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem called out to Adam Arishon after the initial sin with the Eitz Hadas of eating from the tree of knowledge in Gan Eden, and the Torah tells us, Vayama lo ayeka. Hashem called out to Adam and said, where are you? And the Medrash connects this call to Adam, ayeka, with the word Eicha, made up of the same letters. We ask ourselves, where are we? How could we have gotten ourselves into this state? But it is, on some level, our response to the original calling out to Adam Arishon. We respond to that question of Ayeka with Eicha. Here's where we are. We are in this state of desolation, and we feel bad about it. And we're crying our own Bechia Lidoros because we want to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We want to put an end to this sadness, to this desolation, to this devastation, to the destruction that we have suffered and endured for so long. And we want to restore ourselves to Chadesh Yameinu Kikedim, to the days of old, as the Megillah ends at the very, very end with that plea. And this is what Kinnos are all about. How do we cry out to Hashem? In the recitation of Arami Oved Avi, when we speak about our national history, we say, Vayishma Hashem es kolenu, vayaras anyenu. Hashem heard our voices and He saw our oppression. Chaim Kanievsky Shlita, explains that the Torah doesn't say Vayishma Hashem as Dvarenu, Hashem heard our words, but just Hashem heard our voices. Sometimes what's necessary is not so much the words, but the crying out itself. That's what we do. We don't necessarily have the perfect words. What vocabulary do you use to express the depths of despair into which we have descended over the centuries? So the Gemara in Brachos says that the prayer of Ashrei Yoshrei Veisecha, in which we sing the praises of Hashem, is so dear before HaKadosh Baruch Hu for a couple of reasons, but one of the main ones is that it goes through the entirety of the Aleph base. We sing the praises of Hashem, starting with the Aleph, going through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and concluding with the Taf. Why is going through the alphabet of such a significance? So Soloveitchik explains it's of significance because it is an acknowledgement that our vocabulary is so limited, and therefore we simply say some type of praise using every single letter of the alphabet in order to try to utilize that as a template for the totality of expressions that we want to be able to express in front of Hashem. So we say, here's something with an aleph, and add everything that could have started with an aleph, and we're going to do the same with every letter of the alphabet, and that's meant to cover everything, the totality of human expression, because how do you properly praise a Kodesh Baruch Hu? By the same token, says the Rav, how do you properly cry out in front of a Kodesh Baruch Hu? So we go through the same alphabet. That's why in Megillah Eicha, the first four prakim all go through the alphabet, starting with Aleph and ending with Taf, and why so many Kinnos go through the alphabet of starting with Aleph and ending with Taf, because we use the alphabet as our template for the totality of human expression, to express all of the suffering and all of the desolation that we feel, how heartbroken and how forlorn we find ourselves in the wake of the terrible tragedies of Tisha B'Av. And it is perhaps also a an additional reason why we utilize the language of the Aleph base, because the language of the Aleph base is the language of the Lashon HaKodesh, of the Hebrew language that itself, according to the Ramban, is called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, because it is the language in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. It's the language in which Hashem spoke to all of the Nevi'im, spoke to all of the prophets. So we're not only expressing the totality of human expression, but also the totality of the Jewish experience from the creation of the world until the present day. We have experienced so much calamity, pogroms, crusades, blood libels, Holocaust, which we also commemorate on Tisha B'Av. And therefore, in order to access the totality of our experience, we also use the Aleph base of the Hebrew language, even if the words are sometimes hard and difficult to understand and decipher. But nonetheless, this is a way of accessing all of our history. A final reason might be for the explanation that the Rambam gives as to why Hebrew is called the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. The Rambam says, of course, it's Lashon Nakia because it's a language which is refined and dignified. We don't even have a word to describe certain parts of the human anatomy because we be considered too coarse, too vulgar, too unrefined. And this is also something we express in the depths of our darkness and despair, how we have maintained and retained and preserved our dignity throughout all of our travails. We were saved from Mitzrayim in part because Loshinu es Shmam, Loshinu es Lashonim, Loshinu es Mabusham. We didn't change our names. We didn't change our language. We didn't change our garb. We always maintained that separate sense of dignity and refinement, even when we were treated savagely and coarsely by other nations. That was true in the Holocaust as well. The great victory of the Jewish people is our ability not only to survive, but also to maintain our sense of inner dignity and strength. And therefore, on Tisha B'Av, we cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Aleph base, because the Aleph base also represents that Kedusha and Tara, that holiness and purity, which is what has enabled our people to remain strong and to remain worthy of redemption. So we use that language as well on Tisha B'Av. And when we use all of these different expressions, we cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We say, Eicha, um, we are here, but we're not where we want to be. How could we have fallen so far from grace? We want so much to come back to the embrace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the crying out of a child for its father, because we know that at the end, Vayishma Hashem es kolenu, if we cry out properly, if we perform this preemptive strike, so to speak, of doing the Kinnos ourselves rather than waiting for tragedy, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there to listen to us and to restore us not only to our local Bate Knesios, but to enable us to rebuild the third base Hamikdash. The Gemara in Tainis says, al Yerushalayim zocha v'roa b'simchasa. If you mourn properly over Yerushalayim, then you'll be worthy of seeing in the happiness of Yerushalayim. That perhaps was the message of the conversation that Rabbi Akiva had with his colleagues when they were walking on the Temple Mount and they saw a fox run out from the place where the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, had been, and Rabbi Akiva's rabbinic colleagues, including Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua, they started crying, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. And they turned to Rabbi Akiva and they said, "Why are you laughing?" And Rabbi Akiva gave them a good Jewish answer. He said, "Well, why are you crying?" They said, "What do you mean, why are we crying? The fox is running out from the place of the base of Mikdash. We're not going to be crying." And Rabbi Akiva said that, "Well, this is why I'm laughing." He said, "I'm laughing because the prophet Yeshayahu Hanavi, he juxtaposed two nevuos, two prophecies. He spoke about how v'aida li edim ne'emanim. I'm going to testify with reliable witnesses. Who are they? As Uriah Cohen Mesachaya ben Yevarchayahu. One prophet was Uriah HaKohen, and one prophet was Zechariah ben Yevarchayahu. But explain Rabbi Akiva, there's an inner contradiction here because Uriah HaKohen prophesied during the first Beis HaMikdash period, and Zechariah ben Yevarchayahu prophesied during the second Beis HaMikdash period. Why is Yeshayahu Hanavi juxtaposing the two of them when they lived in two totally different times? So the answer must be that when the prophecy of one becomes true, the prophecy of the other will become true. And Uriah HaKohen said the prophecy of Tzion Sadet Techarash, that the area of Zion, of the Holy of Holies, of the Beis HaMikdash, is going to become plowed over like a field. That's what we just witnessed when we saw the fox run out from the place of the Holy of Holies. So it must be that the nevuah, the prophecy of Zechariah, is going to come true as well. What was the prophecy of Zechariah? O Yeshu is Zekanim Kinnos Bechovos Yerushalayim, that the old men and the old women are still going to be sitting in the future in peace and tranquility in the streets of Yerushalayim, that this is something that we now know is going to happen, that we will have a rebuilt Beis HaMikdash, we will have a restored sovereign state with the Malchus Beis David, because of the fox that we saw running out from the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. This is why I'm laughing, explained Rabbi Akiva to his rabbinic colleagues. And they turned to him and they said, Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva nichamtanu, Rabbi Akiva, you've comforted us. What does it mean? It was Rabbi Akiva laughing because he thought it was funny that a fox should run out from the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Not at all. Rabbi Akiva understood that there would be laughter, but that's only because his rabbinic colleagues were crying. Of course, they were crying. It was appropriate to cry. But if you cry, then you can enjoy the laughter later on. A major part of the Kinnos is because we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu established this as a day of crying because we should be yearning for the Beis HaMikdash. We should be yearning for a greater closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if we fulfill that mandate, and we do cry on this day, and we cry properly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we cry with a sense of expressing ourselves as fully as we possibly can, with a recognition of the inadequacy of our vocabulary, but a crying out nonetheless to express through every fiber of our being our misery in not being closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. we cry out with a sense of our belonging to the totality of Jewish tradition and history, and caring about all of the suffering that our ancestors and our relatives have suffered over the years and endured throughout the millennia, that we understand that we belong to a community of the generations, a community of a timeless tradition, a crying out that reminds us of our sacred duty to portray ourselves with the utmost dignity and refinement in the eyes of Hashem and in the eyes of the world. So then we can count on a nechama, then we can count on the comfort of being able to see Yerushalayim b'simchasa, Jerusalem restored and rebuilt with great happiness, so that the Moed of Tisha B'Av that we refer to in Megillas Eicha as Korah Lai Moed, that this is a day of a festival. We don't say Tachnun on Tisha B'Av because it's a festival, but it's a festival that was marked with sadness, unfortunately, that should be a festival that shall be transformed into Sason, Simcha, into happiness, that we should be Zoche very soon, if not this Tisha B'Av, and God willing, this Tisha B'Av. But if not, then at least as soon as possible for a fulfillment of Afakti Evlam L'Sason, V'nichamtim Mesimachtim Bigonam, that the day of mourning shall be transformed into a day of joy. We should be comforted. We should be uplifted to great heights of happiness, and we shall be brought out of our despondency. It's our prayer, particularly this year. The Kinnos, the crying out of the Kinnos, will lift us up from our despondency in terms of the current pandemic that's afflicting the world, and shall lift us to redemption for our people, for the entire world, for restoration of the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, b'mheira v'yameinu.